Everyone thinks SpongeBob SquarePants is the safest show on television. A yellow sponge who never swears, never fights, never scares anyone. Just jokes, jellyfish, and a pink starfish best friend. The internet disagrees, and some of it isn't even fiction. In this video, we break down the complete SpongeBob Creepypasta Iceberg, Squidward's suicide, the original Red Mist tape. Squidward's suicide is the story that started the entire SpongeBob horror world online. It also goes by the name Red Mist. Before this story showed up, nobody was making fake lost episodes about SpongeBob SquarePants. After it showed up, hundreds of people tried to copy it. This section walks through where the story came from, what it actually says happened, how people reacted to it, and why it still gets brought up more than 20 years later. SpongeBob SquarePants started airing in 1999. By 2005, the show was already one of the biggest cartoons on television. Kids watched it after school. Teenagers who grew up with it kept watching it because the jokes worked on two levels, one for little kids and one for older viewers who caught the sharper humor. Nickelodeon leaned on the show hard, building toys, video games, and a movie around it. Because it was everywhere, it became the kind of show that almost everyone recognized, even people who did not watch cartoons anymore. That kind of massive reach matters for this story, because a scary tale about a show nobody knew would go nowhere. A scary tale about a show every single person had already seen as a kid hits differently. At the same time, a different corner of the internet was growing. Message boards and image boards, places like early forums and later sites such as 4chan and 7chan, had sections built around ghost stories, urban legends, and horror writing. People would post stories claiming something happened to them personally, even when the story was clearly made up. These posts were not signed with a real name. Nobody could check where they came from. That made them spread faster, because readers had nothing to compare the claim against. A story could say it came from an insider at a toy company, a hospital worker, or someone who worked in television, and there was no way to prove otherwise unless someone did real digging. This environment is what people now call creepypasta culture, a mix of copied and pasted horror stories that jump from board to board, losing and gaining small details each time someone reposts them. Squidward's suicide showed up right in the middle of that culture, posted anonymously on the paranormal board of 7chan. The person posting claimed they had worked as an intern at Nickelodeon. According to the post, the writer was one of a small group of people, including animators and sound editors, gathered to review a tape that was supposed to contain the season 4 premiere episode. The tape they expected was called Fear of a Krabby Patty. Instead, when they put it in and watched, the title card read, Squidward's Suicide. The story explains that this kind of thing was not entirely unusual on its own. According to the account, animators sometimes gave rough cuts joke titles before the real name was finalized, so nobody in the room panicked right away. One of the interns even laughed a little at the title, assuming it was some kind of inside joke among the crew. The music that played over the opening was the same cheerful theme the show always used. Nothing about the first few seconds felt out of place. According to the version of the text preserved on fan wikis, the fake opening credits even listed 5 made-up names for the crew: Madison Richards, Andrew Skinner, Paul McLeod, Trent Hindley, and Dylan Grant. A small touch that added another layer of false authenticity, since real credits are something an actual audience almost never questions or double-checks while watching. The episode, as described in the post, opens on Squidward practicing his clarinet in his home, playing badly, which was completely normal for the character. SpongeBob and Patrick are outside laughing, and Squidward gets annoyed and tells them to be quiet because he has a concert that night. This part of the story matches the way the real show usually treats Squidward, a character who fails at music but keeps trying anyway, hoping for approval he never gets from anyone around him. Up to this point, nothing in the story would raise suspicion. It plays like a completely normal SpongeBob episode. Then the concert scene happens. In the story, Squidward performs and the crowd boos him, which again lines up with how the actual show usually treats his music. Readers who know the show closely have pointed out one small detail that breaks from the ordinary pattern here, that SpongeBob himself joins in with the booing, something the real character almost never does, since he is written across the actual show as endlessly supportive of Squidward, even when nobody else is. That single detail, a friendly character suddenly acting unfriendly for no clear reason, is a small early signal buried inside the story that something about this version of the world is not right, well before anything overtly violent happens on screen. The story adds something new right alongside this moment. According to the post, everyone in the crowd, including SpongeBob and Patrick, suddenly has red eyes, similar to the way a real fish looks when its eyes catch the light. This detail becomes one of the most repeated images tied to the whole story, showing up in fan art, video thumbnails, and later imitation stories for years afterward. The camera then cuts to Squidward alone in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, crying with his head down. This is where the story shifts from an odd retelling of a normal SpongeBob plot into something meant to disturb the people supposedly watching it. According to the account, as Squidward sits there crying, the picture on screen begins to interrupt itself. Single still frames flash between the normal animation, and those frames show disturbing images that do not belong in a children's show at all. The post claims these images looked unusually realistic compared to the flat, simple art style the show normally uses, almost like something something pasted in from outside the cartoon completely. This mismatch between the soft, cartoonish animation and the sudden realistic images is the exact detail that made the story stand out from other horror posts at the time. Sound also changes during this part, with wind noises, distorted laughter, and a low humming tone replacing the normal cartoon sound effects. The story closes with Squidward taking his own life on screen, followed by a strange final shot before the tape cuts to static. According to the post, after the screening ended, the room sat in silence, and the tape was taken away, with staff being told never to speak about what they had seen. The anonymous poster ends the account by saying they were sharing the story because they could not keep quiet about it any longer. None of this actually aired. There is no such episode in the official run of SpongeBob SquarePants. No cast member, animator, or Nickelodeon employee has ever confirmed anything close to this happening. Some pages tracking the story's history point out one more specific error buried inside the original post, that the writer claims to have worked inside Nickelodeon Studios itself during production, when in reality SpongeBob SquarePants was never produced there at all, but instead at a separate animation studio based in Los Angeles. This kind of small factual slip is common across hoax stories written by outsiders who know the general shape of an industry without knowing its specific internal details, and it stands as one of the clearer pieces of evidence that the story was written by someone without any real inside connection to the show at all. The story exists only as a piece of writing posted on an anonymous board, later copied onto other sites word for word, and eventually turned into fan-made video versions built with edited screenshots and sound effects to imitate the feeling of an actual lost tape. Some of the earliest video attempts to bring the story to life used real SpongeBob clips spliced together with darker sound design, giving casual viewers who stumbled onto the video without context the impression it might be real, at least for a few seconds. What made this particular story spread so far, compared to countless other anonymous horror posts from the same era, comes down to a few things working together. The first is the mismatch already mentioned, a beloved kids' cartoon paired with violent, unsettling imagery. That contrast is uncomfortable in a way that grabs attention fast. The second is the format. The story was not written like a ghost story, with a narrator setting a scary mood. It was written like an eyewitness account from someone inside the industry, which made it feel more like a leak than a piece of fiction. The third reason is timing. Message boards in the mid-2000s were still a fairly small, tight-knit space, meaning a striking post could get shared, screenshotted, and reposted across many different communities within days, each repost picking up new readers who had never seen it before. Because of how well this story worked, it did not stay unique for long. Other writers noticed the reaction Squidward's suicide got and began writing their own versions of the same basic idea, a normal kids show hiding a secret disturbing episode nobody was supposed to see. These copies used different shows, different characters, and different plots, but almost all of them borrowed the same core structure, an insider claiming they saw something forbidden, followed by a description of violent or disturbing images breaking through otherwise normal footage. Within a couple of years, this had become such a common pattern across horror writing communities that some sites dedicated to hosting these stories started rejecting new lost episode submissions altogether, because so many were low-effort copies of the same idea Squidward's suicide had already done first and done better. Reviewers looking back at the wider lost episode genre have pointed out that later imitators, trying to explain why nobody could ever find a second copy of their own fake tape, often leaned on stranger and stranger justifications, claiming the footage came from an untraceable broadcast signal or a copy bought from some impossible shop that could never be found again. Squidward's suicide never needed any of that. Its entire premise stayed grounded in something mundane and believable, an internal screening inside a real production studio, which is part of why later, more elaborate excuses used by copycat stories tend to feel weaker by comparison. The story also picked up a specific term that stuck around in horror writing communities for years afterward, the idea of hyper-realistic imagery breaking into normal animation. Writers kept reusing that exact concept, describing photographs or realistic faces appearing inside cartoon scenes, even though true hyper-realism is not something cartoon animation from that era could actually produce with the tools available at the time. The phrase became something of a signature, a way for readers to instantly recognize when a story was borrowing directly from the blueprint Squidward's suicide had set. Online reviewers and horror content creators eventually took notice of the story as well, treating it less like something to be scared of and more like a piece of internet history worth breaking down. One well-known example comes from a reviewer working under the name Fellis, who covered the story as the second entry in a dedicated series built around reading and reacting to popular creepypasta stories, treating it as a piece of writing worth analyzing rather than simply retelling. Video creators built entire episodes around reading the story out loud and reacting to it, discussing why it worked as a piece of writing and comparing it against the wave of copies it inspired. This kind of coverage helped keep the story alive long after the original board post would have otherwise faded into obscurity, since new viewers kept discovering it through these later videos instead of the original 2005 post itself. By the time the 2010s rolled around, Squidward's suicide had become something close to a founding text for an entire subgenre of internet horror, sitting alongside other well-known lost media and lost episode stories from the same period. Fans built timelines tracking every known copy of the tape that had surfaced online, noting small differences between versions, since different uploaders often changed small details like the ending or added extra scenes of their own. Some versions gave Squidward an alternate ending where he survives the gunshot but remains badly hurt, adding a strange unrelated character who appears briefly before the tape cuts out, an odd side character sometimes called the Scottish Fish, who appears asking for spare change before transforming into an entirely different, unrelated cryptid altogether once Squidward has nothing to give him. This kind of strange, almost comedic detour, tacked onto the end of an otherwise dark story, shows how loosely different rewritten versions of the same tape were willing to bend the tone once enough different anonymous writers had taken their own turn adding to it. These differences turned the story into something closer to a shared universe built by many different anonymous writers, rather than a single fixed piece of fiction. The character born from this story, often referred to by fans using the Red Mist name, eventually became recognizable enough on its own that it started appearing outside of plain text posts entirely. Fan artists drew their own versions of the bloodied, red-eyed Squidward. Video editors built short horror clips using the concept. The character had, in a strange way, become its own piece of internet folklore, separate from the original written post that created it, recognized by people who had never actually read the full original story and only knew the general idea secondhand. What makes this particular piece of internet horror worth studying closely, compared to the many imitators it inspired, is how carefully it was built to feel plausible for its era. It did not rely on jump scares or supernatural monsters. It relied on the discomfort of imagining something wrong hidden inside something completely familiar and safe. Everyone who grew up watching SpongeBob already had a clear picture in their head of what a normal episode looked and sounded like. The story only needed to break that picture slightly, adding just enough wrongness to make the idea unsettling, without needing elaborate special effects or complicated plotting. That restraint, oddly enough, is part of why it worked as well as it did, and why so many later copies that piled on extra violence and shock value never managed to match the original's impact. Even critics who have picked the story apart over the years, pointing out that its own title spoils exactly how the story ends before a reader even begins, tend to agree that the pacing and structure of the writing itself still hold up decades later, which is a rare thing for a piece of anonymous internet horror fiction to achieve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That changed in a way almost nobody expected, when the show itself, more than a decade after the story first appeared, put a piece of it directly on screen. That moment is where this video picks up next. Section 2. The show broke canon. To reference it, for 14 years, Squidward's suicide lived only in the world of message boards, horror writing sites, and fan-made videos. Nickelodeon had nothing to do with any of it. The people who ran the actual show had no reason to even know the story existed, since it was written by an anonymous stranger with no connection to the studio at all. That changed in September of 2019, when an episode called SpongeBob in Random Land aired and quietly put a piece of the creepypasta directly into the show itself, for the very first time in the franchise's history. To understand how unusual this moment really is, it helps to look at how separate the show and its surrounding internet culture had always stayed up to that point. SpongeBob SquarePants had been running for 2 decades by 2019, and across that entire run, the internet had built an enormous amount of content around the show that had nothing to do with anything the actual writers or animators had made. Memes, fan theories, reaction videos, edited clips, and entire alternate character concepts spread constantly, completely separate from the studio itself. Almost none of that outside material ever crossed back into the official show in any confirmed way. Writers working on new episodes generally built stories using the same characters, settings, and humor style the show had always used, without reaching outside into fan-made internet content for inspiration or reference. This general separation is part of what makes the door scene inside SpongeBob in Random Land stand out so sharply once fans caught it, since it broke a pattern that had held steady for the better part of 20 years. SpongeBob in Random Land is a normal episode on the surface. It comes from season 12 of the show, airing as part of a pairing alongside a second short titled SpongeBob's Bad Habit, a segment following SpongeBob struggling with an unexplained habit of biting his nails. The Random Land half of the pairing follows a simple setup. Squidward gets a phone call from someone living in a place called Random Land, asking for a Krabby Patty delivery. Squidward tries to say no, since Random Land has a reputation as a strange and dangerous place, but Mr. Krabs forces both him and SpongeBob to make the delivery anyway, since a paying customer is a paying customer, no matter how frightening the neighborhood sounds. SpongeBob and Squidward set out walking, and along the way, SpongeBob starts doing what the episode calls random walking, which eventually causes his own body to vanish from the screen entirely. Squidward finds this funny and copies the random dance himself, only for his body to disappear the same way. The two of them end up physically transported into Random Land itself, sliding down a long stretch of ground until they land inside the town, a place where where the normal rules of shape, color, and logic simply stop applying. Once inside Random Land, the episode leans fully into the idea that nothing there behaves the way it should. Houses turn upside down. Ordinary objects act in ways that make no sense. At one point, a realtor character inside the episode is shown moving an entire screen upside down and pushing it towards SpongeBob, part of a broader string of visual gags built entirely around the idea that logic simply does not apply once a character crosses into Random Land's borders. The overall tone stays light and silly for most of the runtime, closer to a fever dream than anything meant to unsettle anyone watching. This matters because it sets up exactly why the one specific scene buried inside the episode stood out so sharply once fans spotted it. At one point during their trip through Random Land, SpongeBob and Squidward come across a wall covered in doors, each one leading somewhere different and strange, fitting the general chaos of the town around them. Squidward opens one of the doors positioned above him. Behind it, for a brief moment, sits what looks like a copy of his own bedroom back home, something familiar in the middle of all the surrounding weirdness. Almost immediately, the picture inside that doorway breaks apart into static. For a single flash, the screen shows a close-up of Squidward's face, except his eyes are wide, bloodshot, and outlined with streaks running down like dark tears. The moment lasts barely long enough to register on a first watch. Then the episode moves on, as if nothing happened, continuing the random comedy exactly where it left off. That single flashed image is a direct visual reference to the Squidward described inside the Red Mist story, the same bloodied, wide-eyed version of the character that had circulated across fan art and video edits for over a decade by that point. This was not a vague nod that could be explained away as coincidence. The imagery matched closely enough that horror and creepypasta communities online recognized it almost immediately once clips of the episode started circulating after it aired. The timing of the discovery matters here as much as the reference itself. SpongeBob in Random Land first aired in the United Kingdom and Ireland on September 11, 2019, ahead of its release in the United States roughly a week and a half later. Viewers in the US saw the episode land in their own listings not long after, and it was American audiences, given the size of the SpongeBob fan community there, who first began circulating screenshots and short clips of the door scene once people realized what they had just watched flash across their screen. Within a short stretch of time, fans who had grown up reading the Squidward suicide story were sharing side-by-side comparisons of the flashed frame from the show against the version of the character drawn in years of fan art. The match was close enough that there was little room for doubt about where the imagery had come from. What makes this moment genuinely rare in the history of the show is that Nickelodeon almost never references outside fan content inside an actual episode. SpongeBob SquarePants has run for decades and built an enormous amount of internet culture around it, completely separate from anything the studio itself created, from memes to fan theories to entire alternate versions of characters built by fans with no involvement from the show's writers. Almost none of that outside material ever finds its way back into the official show. A single frame flashed inside a season 12 episode, built directly around a piece of anonymous internet horror writing from 2005, stands out as one of the clearest examples of the show's own creative team acknowledging a piece of fan culture that grew completely outside their control. The episode itself carries a credited writer named Kaz, who worked on this particular installment of the show. Fans digging through the episode after the door scene discovery found other small personal touches tied to the writer scattered throughout the same episode, showing that the door scene was not the only detail placed there for close viewers to eventually notice. A background chalkboard appearing during one of the Random Land scenes includes a written equation reading K equals AZ squared, spelling out the writer's own name through a simple piece of math notation hidden in the background art. The same blackboard also includes the numbers 1220 written alongside the equation, matching the episode's own internal production code, a small detail meant purely for anyone pausing the episode closely enough to notice it rather than something built to be seen during a normal viewing. Beyond the blackboard, the episode also includes a brief live-action cameo appearance during one of its stranger sequences, showing a man styled to resemble Kaz himself, cutting his hair in a way visually modeled after a neatly trimmed lawn, a purely visual joke tied to his name that has nothing to do with the plot around it. Other small touches scattered throughout the episode point toward the same layered, detail-heavy approach. Near the end of the episode, a character referred to by fans as the funny lady breaks the fourth wall directly, acknowledging the audience in a way the show does not do often. The episode's closing shot shows a worm moving through a circular iris effect, baring its teeth toward the audience just before the screen displays the word end, a small stylistic flourish tying back to old-fashioned cartoon endings from decades before SpongeBob itself existed. None of these details relate directly to the Red Mist reference, but they show that the episode as a whole was built with a level of personal detail and inside references layered throughout, which fits with how deliberately placed the Squidward flash appears once viewers know to look for it. An episode already this dense with small, easily missed details makes the door scene feel less like an isolated accident and more like one more piece of a broader pattern the writer had already built into the episode from the very beginning. The plot itself resolves on a note that fans have described as unexpectedly bittersweet given the show's usual tone. SpongeBob and Squidward do eventually succeed in delivering the Krabby Patty to its original customer, technically completing the job that sent them into Random Land in the first place. Despite that success, the episode closes with Mr. Krabs in tears, upset over a store policy stating that any order arriving late does not get paid for, meaning the entire chaotic trip through Random Land ultimately earns the Krusty Krab nothing at all. This small, quietly downbeat ending sits at odds with the loud, chaotic comedy that fills most of the runtime, giving the episode an odd undercurrent of disappointment layered underneath its randomness, not unlike the brief, unsettling flash hidden earlier inside the door scene itself. The reference did not stay on air for long. According to records kept by fan wikis tracking the show's episode history, the version of SpongeBob in Random Land containing the bloodied Squidward flash aired in the United States between September and November of 2019. After that window, the scene was quietly replaced. In the edited version that has aired since, the same moment inside the door now shows baby Squidward sitting inside a diaper instead of the bloodied red-eyed image that originally flashed there. The change was not announced with any kind of official explanation from Nickelodeon, and no public statement was made confirming exactly why the switch happened. Fans simply noticed, after comparing later airings against recordings and clips saved from the original broadcast window, that the scene had been swapped out entirely. International broadcasts tell a different story. Multiple fan wikis tracking the show across different countries confirm that airings outside the United States kept the original bloodied Squidward version long after the American broadcast had already replaced it with the diaper scene. Clips recorded from broadcasts in other countries, including versions dubbed into different languages, continued showing the original red mist flash years after American television had already moved on to the edited cut. This split between the American version and the international version became its own small point of discussion inside fan communities, since it meant the exact same episode existed in two different forms depending entirely on which country happened to be watching it. Viewers outside the United States who had no prior familiarity with the Squidward suicide creepypasta at all were, for years, watching a version of the episode that longtime American fans could no longer see through ordinary television broadcast, creating an unusual situation where the more disturbing version of the scene became the norm outside the country the show was originally produced in, while the tamer version became standard within it. The DVD release of the season added one more layer to the story. When the physical Season 12 box set eventually came out, fans checking the included version of SpongeBob in Random Land found that it preserved the original bloodied Squidward scene rather than the edited diaper version that had already replaced it on American television by that point. This meant that even after the reference had technically been pulled from regular broadcast, it remained accessible and preserved through the physical DVD copy of the season, giving fans a permanent way to see the original scene exactly as it had first aired. For collectors and fans specifically interested in preserving pieces of the show's broadcast history, this made the physical DVD release something closer to a small archive, holding on to a version of the episode that television broadcast in the United States had already moved past. There is no confirmed, official explanation from Nickelodeon covering exactly why the scene was pulled from American television after those first 2 months. Fans have discussed possible reasons among themselves, ranging from concern about the intensity of the imagery for younger viewers to a general decision to quietly walk back a reference that had drawn more attention online than the studio may have expected going in. None of these explanations have ever been confirmed directly by anyone at Nickelodeon, and no interview or official statement addressing the removal has been made public. What can be confirmed, based on the surviving broadcast history and the wiki records tracking it, is simply that the scene existed on American air for a specific window of time, then stopped, while continuing to exist elsewhere. Taken together, this moment turns Squidward's suicide from a piece of outside internet writing into something with a small but real thread connecting it back to the actual show. A story written by an anonymous stranger on a message board in 2005, with absolutely no connection to Nickelodeon, ended up flashed across an actual episode 14 years later, watched by the same wide audience that tunes into any other new SpongeBob episode. For the small number of people who caught the reference in real time and understood what they were looking at, this was as close as the internet horror world had ever come to seeing an outside fan creation acknowledged inside the actual world of the show. For everyone else watching without that context, the moment passed by in less than a second, indistinguishable from any other quick sight gag buried inside an episode already built around visual chaos and random imagery. This is also where the iceberg starts to shift direction. Up to this point, everything covered has come from outside the show, written and spread entirely by fans with no official involvement. The door scene marks the only confirmed instance where the show's own production reached back into that fan-made horror world and pulled a piece of it directly onto the screen, even briefly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From here, the story moves away from anonymous internet posts entirely and into something that happened decades later, built not around a hoax claiming to be be real, but around an artist openly creating new horror using the same characters, in a way that would end up reaching a far larger audience than the original 2005 post ever did. Section 3. The Secret Formula, a new kind of SpongeBob horror. For nearly 2 decades, every piece of SpongeBob horror content built itself around one basic trick: an anonymous stranger claiming to have seen something real. Squidward's suicide worked that way. So did the wave of copycat lost episode stories that followed it. So did the door scene hidden inside SpongeBob in Random Land, since even that official reference only worked because audiences already understood the hoax it was winking at. In the summer of 2024, a completely different kind of SpongeBob horror content showed up online, and this time, nobody pretended it was real. A writer and illustrator named Marcus Yu released a webcomic called The Secret Formula, and instead of hiding behind an anonymous message board post, he put his own name directly on the work. The core idea behind The Secret Formula flips the most famous plot device in the entire SpongeBob franchise. For decades, the actual show has repeated one running joke over and over: Plankton trying and failing to steal the secret formula for the Krabby Patty from Mr. Krabs. It happens in dozens of episodes. It is one of the most recognizable pieces of the show's basic setup, right alongside SpongeBob's job at the Krusty Krab and Squidward's miserable neighbor situation. Yu's comic takes that exact setup and asks a different question. What happens after Plankton finally succeeds? What if he actually gets the formula he has chased his entire life, only to discover that getting it was the easy part, and that the secret hidden inside it is something far worse than a simple recipe? According to coverage of the comic from horror entertainment outlet Dread Central, written by staff writer Chad Collins and published on July 10, 2024, the story follows Plankton finally getting his hands on the Krabby Patty formula, only to realize too late that some secrets were better left unheard. Once he understands what he has actually uncovered, the comic pushes him into confronting hidden atrocities buried underneath Bikini Bottom, forcing him to decide whether he can hold on to his own sanity while trying to set things right. That framing alone marks a clear difference from every piece of horror content covered so far in this video. Squidward's suicide and its imitators were built around a single disturbing scene dropped into an otherwise normal episode. The Secret Formula is built like an actual ongoing story, with ongoing narrative structure, character motivation, and a plot that unfolds across multiple volumes rather than ending after one twist. The same coverage describes reaching a final volume of the story, one detailed enough that the reviewer covering it described being personally moved by how it concluded, noting the level of care put into its gruesome final moments as something webcomics of this type rarely receive. The comic itself was published through Webtoons, a platform widely used by independent comic artists to release ongoing serialized work directly to readers, with Yu posting it under his own account there for anyone to read for free. Alongside the main comic, Yu also built out an audio layer to the project through his personal TikTok account, using the handle Pop-Tart-Guap, where he shared additional content tied to the story, including a musical epilogue set to a piece called Jacob and the Stone, composed by Emil Masseri for the film Minari. This detail shows that Yu was not simply illustrating a static comic and walking away from it, but actively building out a broader multimedia experience around the story, across more than one platform, treating the comic less like a single finished piece and more like an ongoing project with additional layers meant to be discovered by readers willing to follow him across different corners of the internet. The comic uses familiar SpongeBob characters and settings, since that recognizable iconography is exactly what makes the horror land as hard as it does. Seeing Plankton, Mr. Krabs, Bikini Bottom, and the Krusty Krab rendered in a much darker, more serious art style creates the same kind of unsettling contrast that made the original Squidward suicide post work so well back in 2005. Familiar characters placed somewhere they were never meant to go. According to Dread Central's coverage, the comic's setting stretches well beyond just the Krusty Krab itself, pulling in other established locations and characters from the show's existing canon, including Rock Bottom and Karen, Plankton's own computer wife from the actual series, both used as part of the comic's expanded, darker version of Bikini Bottom. The coverage specifically describes the comic as subverting expectations for longtime fans familiar with the source material, rendering characters typically framed as heroes into villains, and reversing that same dynamic in the other direction as well. The difference between this and everything covered earlier in this video is that you built this contrast on purpose, as a piece of original creative work, rather than presenting it as a leaked tape or a stolen recording. Fans engaging with the comic know from the very first panel that they are reading a piece of fan-made horror fiction, often labeled by fans themselves as a SpongeBob horror alternate universe, rather than being tricked into thinking they might be looking at something real. Dread Central's coverage draws a direct line between the secret formula and material that already existed inside the actual show, pointing out that SpongeBob SquarePants has, on rare occasion, flirted with horror influences of its own, even within its normal, official episodes. The coverage specifically references the hash-slinging slasher, a horror movie character that appears within the show's own canon, along with a visual homage to Count Orlok, the vampire character from the classic 1922 silent horror film Nosferatu. Both existing as small pieces of horror influenced the show's own writers chose to include over the years. The same coverage also references the Season 8 episode Are You Happy Now?, describing it as flirting with unusually dour material for the show, and directly references the events covered earlier in this video, Inside SB-129, describing Squidward being transported to a realm of nothingness and grappling with nihilism and considerable existential dread, matching the same nowhere sequence already broken down in detail earlier in this video. According to this framing, the secret formula does not represent something completely foreign being forced onto the franchise, but instead builds on a thin thread of horror influence that had technically always existed somewhere inside the show's history, just never as the main focus of an actual episode. The way this comic spread online looks almost nothing like the way Squidward's suicide spread back in 2005. The original creepypasta lived on message boards and slowly crossed over into video reaction content over the following decade. The secret formula spread almost entirely through short video platforms, especially TikTok, where other creators began performing dramatic readings and voice-acted versions of used comic panels, giving Plankton, Mr. Krabs, and SpongeBob their own spoken dialogue over the artwork. Multiple different creators put out their own separate voiceover versions, covering different parts of the story, crediting Yu as the original artist while adding their own vocal performances on top of his panels. This turned the secret formula into something bigger than a single artist's webcomic, closer to a small shared project where different corners of the internet each added their own layer on top of the same original source material. This spread pattern says something about how internet horror culture changed between 2005 and 2024. Message boards required a reader to actively seek out a specific thread or post, then choose to share it somewhere else if they wanted others to see it. Short video platforms work differently, pushing content automatically toward users based on what they have already shown interest in, meaning a single popular voiceover version of one comic panel could reach far more people far faster than any message board post ever could during the mid-2000s. Where Squidward's suicide took years to grow into the wider phenomenon it eventually became, the secret formula reached a wide audience within a much shorter stretch of time, helped along by dozens of separate creators all posting their own versions of the same underlying story within months of its original release. Dread Central's coverage of the comic also placed it inside a much larger trend happening across horror media generally, comparing the general approach behind the secret formula to a wider wave of horror projects built around beloved children's characters, specifically naming the Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey film series as another recent example of that same broader pattern, taking a soft, nostalgic piece of childhood media and twisting it into something violent and disturbing. The coverage frames this trend as neither new nor unique to SpongeBob, noting that turning kids' media into horror has existed in various forms for a long time, while still crediting Yu's specific execution as treading that familiar territory with a level of style the writer found unusually effective compared to similar attempts elsewhere in the genre. The same coverage also connects the appeal of the secret formula to a documented area of psychological research, referencing Coltan Scrivener, a behavioral scientist at Aarhus University in Denmark, who has developed a specific scale used to measure what researchers describe as morbid curiosity, a general interest in frightening or disturbing subject matter. According to this framing, most people fall somewhere in the middle of that scale, holding a moderate amount of natural curiosity toward horror and unsettling content, which the coverage ties to the wider popularity of genres like true crime, regardless of the specific medium they appear in. This gives the secret formula a slightly different explanation for its appeal compared to the original Squidward suicide hoax, since audiences engaging with Yu's comic are not being tricked into wondering if something might be real, but are instead consciously choosing to engage with disturbing content built around characters they already know and trust, driven by that same general, well-documented curiosity toward horror that a wide portion of the population naturally carries to some degree. Because the comic was released and shared with the artist's name clearly attached to it, the secret formula avoided one of the biggest weaknesses that eventually wore down the original creepypasta wave. Fake lost episode stories only work as long as some part of the audience is willing to at least briefly wonder if they might be true. Once that mystery fades and everyone knows the game, the format tends to lose its power, which is part of why so many copycat lost episode stories from the years following 2005 eventually blurred together and stopped landing the same way the original had. A story that openly presents itself as original horror fiction, built by a named creator, does not rely on that same uncertainty to work. It succeeds instead through the quality of the art, the writing, and the twist on familiar characters, which is part of why it managed to pull in both longtime SpongeBob fans and horror fans who had never engaged with any of the older lost episode content at all. The comic spread also brought renewed attention back toward the older parts of this same iceberg. Once the secret formula started circulating widely, some of the same creators covering it in videos and posts began drawing direct comparisons back to Squidward's suicide and the broader lost episode tradition that came before it, treating Yu's work as the newest chapter chapter in a much longer-running story, rather than something that appeared out of nowhere. This connects directly back to the pattern already covered earlier in this video, where a single successful piece of horror content built around a beloved show tends to open the door for a wave of new material following behind it, each new piece building on the audience and attention the previous ones already created. Unlike the anonymous forum post that started this entire iceberg, Marcus Yu remains a known, identifiable creator, continuing to release material and connect with the audience that grew around his work. That alone marks one of the clearest lines separating the newest chapter of SpongeBob horror content from the oldest one. Squidward's suicide exists as a piece of writing with no confirmed author, spread by countless anonymous reposts across nearly 20 years, its exact origins impossible to fully trace back to one single starting point. The secret formula exists as the clearly credited work of one artist, spread rapidly through modern platforms by an audience who choose to voice act, react to, and share it while knowing exactly whose work they are engaging with. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From here, the video moves away from stories built purely around internet mythology and horror fiction entirely, and into something that actually happened on television, backed by real network decisions rather than fan-created content of any kind. Section 4, One Course Meal, when the real show got scarier than the fake ones. One Course Meal is a real episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, produced by the same studio behind every other installment of the show, and it managed to spark more genuine public backlash than almost any piece of fan-made horror content ever did. The episode comes from Season 7, airing as the 9th episode of that season, alongside a second short called Gary in Love. It first aired on March 25, 2010, though it had been produced the year before. Before Nickelodeon settled on the final title, the episode carried a different working name entirely: Plankton Got Served, a title that was eventually dropped in favor of One Course Meal, a play on words swapping the word course for course, hinting at the rough treatment one character receives throughout the story. The episode carries writing credits for 3 people: Casey Alexander, Zeus Service, and Mr. Lawrence. This last name carries an unusual weight once placed next to the plot itself, since Mr. Lawrence is the same performer who has voiced Plankton throughout the entire run of the show. Fans discussing the episode over the years have specifically pointed out how strange it feels that the voice actor responsible for bringing Plankton to life would also help write an episode built entirely around pushing that same character toward attempting suicide, describing it as an unusually uncomfortable piece of behind-the-scenes trivia once fans learned who had a hand in shaping the story. Casey Alexander and Zeus Service, the 2 other credited writers, had worked together on the show since its earlier seasons, contributing to a wide range of episodes across the franchise's run, with One Course Meal eventually becoming one of the most frequently cited examples of their writing style among longtime fans discussing which era of the show's writing they preferred. The plot centers on Mr. Krabs discovering a weakness in his longtime rival Plankton, who runs the chum bucket across the street from the Krusty Krab and spends nearly every episode of the show trying and failing to steal the secret formula for the Krabby Patty. In this episode, Mr. Krabs learns that Plankton is deeply afraid of whales. Once he knows this, Mr. Krabs disguises himself as his own daughter Pearl, who is a whale, purely to terrify Plankton on purpose. The scheme does not stop after one scare. Mr. Krabs keeps up the disguise and the threats over several days, with fan discussions of the episode's timeline generally placing the length of the torment at roughly 2 weeks, and the fear starts building inside Plankton well beyond a single startled reaction, eventually showing up in nightmares where Plankton imagines Pearl and a group of other whales attacking him. The torment builds until Plankton reaches a breaking point. In one of the episode's final scenes, Plankton walks out into the street and lies down in front of an oncoming bus, planning to let it hit him rather than continue living with the fear Mr. Krabs has been feeding him. SpongeBob finds out what Plankton is planning and, rather than stepping in to stop him or show any concern, responds with a casual line acknowledging what Plankton said and simply walking away. When SpongeBob later tells Mr. Krabs that Plankton is lying in the street, Mr. Krabs reacts by laughing at the situation instead of showing any alarm. Later in the episode, SpongeBob does feel enough sympathy for Plankton to reveal one of Mr. Krabs' own secret fears in return, telling Plankton that Mr. Krabs is afraid of mimes. Even armed with that information, Plankton never gets any real chance at payback, since the episode implies Mr. Krabs was never truly afraid of the mime in the first place, meaning even this brief moment of possible balance ends up undercut by the episode's own writing. Plankton survives the moment in the end, but the episode closes without Mr. Krabs facing any real consequence for what he put his rival through, and without either SpongeBob or Plankton's own assistant Karen showing him any comfort or concern along the way. This plot is what set One Course Meal apart from ordinary conflict between the 2 characters. Plankton and Mr. Krabs have been rivals since the earliest days of the show, constantly scheming against each other over the secret formula, but that rivalry almost always plays out through slapstick and exaggerated cartoon logic, not through one character deliberately building up another's fear until it pushes him toward taking his own life. Fans revisiting the episode years later have often pointed to a specific reversal buried inside its structure, that the episode positions Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob, the characters audiences are meant to root for, acting with more cruelty than Plankton, the character normally written as the show's villain, creating a strange discomfort in an episode that never seems to acknowledge that reversal within its own story. Once viewers connected what the episode was actually depicting, reaction to it split sharply, and a portion of the audience felt the show had crossed a line it should never have gotten close to in the first place. That reaction turned into organized action. Multiple petitions were created and posted publicly, calling on Nickelodeon to pull the episode from rotation entirely. According to one detailed account posted publicly by a petition organizer, the decision to start a formal petition followed directly from putting together a personal ranked list of the worst episodes in the show's history, with One Course Meal landing near the very top of that list. The same organizer described a personal connection to the subject matter, mentioning the loss of a family member to suicide and citing awareness of other people within their own community who had been affected by suicide as well, framing the petition as something created specifically on behalf of people who had lived through that kind of loss. These petitions argued that treating a suicide attempt as a punchline, especially inside a show watched heavily by children, sent a harmful message, and that the episode made light of something deeply painful for anyone who had lost a loved one to suicide or struggled with those thoughts personally. Several separate petitions were filed over the following years, each restating similar points: that the episode presented psychological torment as something funny, that Mr. Krabs faced no real punishment for his actions, and that neither SpongeBob nor Karen offered Plankton any support once they learned what he had been driven to attempt. This backlash was not limited to petitions alone. Fan discussion forums dedicated entirely to the show carried extensive threads breaking down the episode scene by scene, with many longtime posters describing it as one of the most disliked entries in the franchise's entire history. Within those same discussions, some fans specifically noted that members of the show's own production team appeared to share the negative view surrounding the episode, describing later interactions and comments from other writers on the show as generally unfavorable toward it, alongside the broader pattern of it airing far less often than other Season 7 episodes. Separate from organized petitions, individual fans also created their own rewritten versions of the episode's plot, posting alternate scripts online that removed the suicide-related content while trying to preserve the basic rivalry between Mr. Krabs and Plankton that the original episode was built around, treating the rewrite as a way of fixing what they saw as the episode's central problem without needing to remove the characters or setting entirely. Despite this level of public pushback, there has never been an official statement from Nickelodeon confirming that the episode was formally banned. What can be confirmed is that One Course Meal became noticeably rare in reruns compared to other Season 7 episodes, airing far less frequently on the network in the years following its original broadcast. Some fans have pointed out that this reduced rerun schedule could be tied to the fact that its paired segment, Gary and Love, carries a Valentine's Day theme, making the episode a poor fit for general rotation outside of that time of year, rather than being solely the result of the controversy itself. Without an official statement from the network explaining the decision either way, the exact reason behind how rarely it airs remains unconfirmed, even though the pattern itself is easy to verify by checking the show's broadcast history. The episode's reputation only grew harsher over time, as more critics and longtime fans revisited it. It was ranked the single worst episode in the entire history of SpongeBob SquarePants on a widely viewed countdown released by the media outlet WatchMojo in April of 2024, placing it above every other episode across the show's full run, including many other installments that fans already considered weak or poorly written. Earlier than that, during a public vote held across the United Kingdom and Ireland in 2012, ranking the show's full catalog of episodes, One Course Meal placed at position 99, landing near the very bottom of that list as well. Independent reviewers covering the show years later continued to single the episode out specifically, with one blog dedicated to reviewing SpongeBob episodes in order describing the writing pairing behind it as consistently misunderstanding what had originally made the show work, arguing that this particular episode showed the writers trying to push the show's dramatic stakes higher without properly considering how that shift would affect the way the audience viewed the characters carrying it out. The episode's darkest angle eventually looped back into the same internet horror culture covered earlier in this video. Fans took the discomfort already built into One Course Meal and pushed it one step further, writing a creepypasta that reused the episode's original working title, Plankton Got Served, as its own name. In this fan-written version, Plankton does not survive his walk into the street. He actually gets hit by the bus, and the story follows him waking up afterward on a strange pillar floating inside an empty void, forced into some version of a heaven or hell judgment, deciding what happens to him next. Unlike Squidward's suicide, which invented an entirely fictional lost episode from scratch, this particular creepypasta took a real, aired, deeply controversial episode and pushed its already uncomfortable ending into something even darker, blurring the line between real television content and fan-made horror horror writing even further than anything covered earlier in this video. What makes one-course meal worth placing at this point in the iceberg is the shift it represents. Every entry covered before this one relied on fiction pretending to be real, or fiction openly built around imaginary horror layered on top of the show. This episode required no invention at all. It aired on national television, produced within the same creative pipeline as every beloved episode fans grew up on, and it generated real petitions, real public argument, and a real reputation as one of the most disturbing pieces of content the franchise ever put its name on, without a single frame of it being fictional or exaggerated by outside writers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Barely more than a decade later, the show would find itself at the center of a second real controversy. This time built not around a story it chose to tell, but around timing it never could have planned for. Section 5. Quarantined Crab. The episode Real Life Delayed. Quarantined Crab sits in a strange place in SpongeBob SquarePants history, since nothing about its content was ever meant to be controversial. It was written and produced as an ordinary episode, built around a familiar type of over-the-top workplace disaster the show has leaned on for years. What turned it into one of the most talked about episodes of the entire series had nothing to do with its writing and everything to do with the timing of when it was scheduled to reach television. The episode is the second segment paired with an episode called Who Are Zoo, coming from season 12 of the show. It was directed by Dave Cunningham and written by Andrew Goodman, and production on it wrapped in 2019, well before anyone had any reason to connect a SpongeBob episode to a global health crisis. The plot follows a normal day at the Krusty Krab, turning into chaos after a local health inspector shows up unannounced, scans the restaurant, and declares it a health hazard. He becomes convinced that someone inside is carrying an illness the episode calls clam flu, a name built as a direct parody of bird flu, since clams within the show's own universe are written to behave the way birds behave in the real world. In response, the inspector locks the entire restaurant down under a full quarantine, trapping everyone inside together with no clear way out. What follows plays out the way most SpongeBob workplace chaos episodes tend to, pushed to an extreme degree. Patrick, confused about what a quarantine even means, gets it explained to him by Squidward, who bluntly describes it as being trapped with a sick person until everyone else gets sick too. Panic spreads through the restaurant. Mr. Krabs starts forcing people into the walk-in freezer out of fear they might be the carrier, showing very little concern for anyone's comfort along the way, including his own employees and customers. As the episode continues, several different made-up illnesses get pinned on different characters, with names built to sound exaggerated and silly. Things like grease gout, moldy measles, trash trichinosis, dust bunny bronchitis, and polyester plague. Eventually, the health inspector realizes his mistake, only to discover that Mr. Krabs himself has somehow ended up with a combination of every single illness at once. In a final burst of panic, a team of workers wearing hazmat suits arrive, seal the entire Krusty Krab building inside a giant crate, and use a helicopter to airlift the whole restaurant away, eventually dropping it directly on top of Plankton's chum bucket across the street, ending the episode on that image. None of this plot was written with any real-world illness in mind. The episode was finished and ready to broadcast well ahead of its original planned release date, initially scheduled as early as April 4th, 2020 in the United States, the exact same stretch of time when the World Health Organization had just formally declared the COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic, and countries around the world were entering lockdowns and mandatory quarantines of their own. An episode about a restaurant being sealed shut and quarantined over fear of an unknown illness, scheduled to air in American households at the exact moment those same households were living through real quarantine orders, created a timing coincidence that Nickelodeon could not ignore. Quarantined Crab was not the only season 12 episode caught in this exact situation. A second segment called Hiccup Plague, paired with an episode titled Lighthouse Louie, ran into an almost identical problem. According to records kept by the show's own wiki, Hiccup Plague had actually completed production back on September 26, 2019, months before Quarantined Crab had even finished its own production process. Its plot follows a case of contagious hiccups spreading across Bikini Bottom after two background characters accidentally set off a chain reaction, eventually causing chaos among the show's main cast as they try to find a cure before it can keep spreading further. Nickelodeon originally scheduled Hiccup Plague to premiere on January 18, 2021, alongside Lighthouse Louie, but pulled it from the lineup just 1 week before that planned air date, replacing its slot with an episode called My Two Krabses instead. According to coverage from IGN, published on March 27, 2021, under the headline SpongeBob SquarePants episodes pulled over storyline concerns, both Quarantined Crab and Hiccup Plague were specifically named together as episodes Nickelodeon had chosen to hold back due to their unintentional similarity to the ongoing pandemic, confirming that this was not an isolated, one-time decision, but a pattern applied across more than one piece of finished season 12 content. Hiccup Plague's own path to broadcast carried a strange wrinkle of its own well before its official pull. According According to the show's wiki, the episode was accidentally leaked in full on a French video-on-demand service called My Canal on May 6, 2020, nearly 8 months before its originally scheduled American premiere. The leaked version remained accessible for over a week before finally being taken down on May 14, 2020, giving a small number of viewers an early, unofficial look at the episode long before Nickelodeon ever intended anyone outside of production to see it. This kind of premature leak, tied directly to an episode that would later be formally delayed for pandemic-related reasons, adds another unusual layer to how this particular stretch of season 12 made its way toward audiences. Unlike the situation surrounding One Course Meal, where no formal statement from the network ever confirmed an official ban, the decision to pull Quarantined Crab from its planned release was directly reported on by entertainment news outlets at the time. Deadline covered the story in March of 2021, reporting that the episode had been pulled from its scheduled airing, specifically over concern about its storyline. Entertainment Weekly ran a similar report the same month, confirming that Nickelodeon made the choice to hold the episode back due to sensitivities surrounding the pandemic. This makes Quarantined Crab one of the clearest confirmed cases in the show's history, where a network directly acknowledged pulling an episode over real-world events, rather than fans speculating about a possible unofficial ban based only on how rarely something aired afterward. The delay ended up stretching on for roughly 2 years. The episode's paired segment, Who Are Zoo, aired as scheduled without any issue, while Quarantined Crab itself sat unreleased in the United States the entire time. Interestingly, this delay only applied to American broadcast. The episode aired normally in a number of other countries throughout 2020 and 2021, meaning international audiences were able to watch the exact same episode years before it finally reached American television. A brief clip from the episode's ending was also accidentally broadcast in the United Kingdom directly following the airing of Who Are Zoo in February of 2020, months before the full episode was pulled from the American schedule, adding one more small wrinkle to its already unusual release history. Both delayed episodes ended up returning to American television within a week of each other, closing out season 12 together. According to records tracking the season's full broadcast history, Hiccup Plague and Quarantined Crab had originally been scheduled to premiere on May 13th and May 27th of 2022, positioned to air following the conclusion of the first half of a separate Nickelodeon series called The Patrick Star Show. Nickelodeon ultimately chose to pull the final 3 planned premiere slots for that other series and gave the freed up time to SpongeBob instead, moving Hiccup Plague and Quarantined Crab up to air on April 22 and April 29th of 2022, closing out season 12 roughly a month earlier than originally planned. Quarantined Crab finally made its official American debut on April 29th, 2022, becoming the very last episode of season 12 to air, despite having been fully completed years earlier and originally intended to air as a fairly ordinary mid-season episode rather than a season finale. The gap between its intended release and its actual broadcast date placed it among the largest gaps ever recorded between a SpongeBob episode's production and its eventual airing, a distinction usually reserved for episodes affected by unrelated scheduling issues rather than a deliberate hold tied to outside world events. Records tracking the full season note that Quarantined Crab specifically held the record for the single longest gap between a scheduled and actual air date across the entire season, while Hiccup Plague separately held the record for the longest gap between the completion of production and an episode's eventual broadcast, meaning the 2 delayed episodes each set a different kind of record within the same troubled season. The episode's unusual history did not end once it finally aired. When Nickelodeon released the complete 12th season on DVD, Quarantined Crab was left out of that collection entirely, making it the only episode from the entire season missing from the physical release. This marked only the second time in the franchise's history that an episode had been excluded from a season's DVD set, following an earlier decision, years before, to leave the episode Help Wanted off the complete first season release for entirely unrelated reasons. Hiccup Plague, despite facing the same general pandemic-related delay, was treated differently by comparison. According to the show's own wiki, Hiccup Plague was included on the complete 12th season DVD release, and was also made available for purchase through the American iTunes Store starting January 1, 2022, months before it ever aired on broadcast television in the United States. This meant that, for a period of time, American viewers willing to buy the episode digitally or pick up the physical season set were able to watch Hiccup Plague before Nickelodeon ever allowed it back onto its own broadcast schedule, something that never applied to Quarantined Crab, which remained fully unavailable through any official American channel until its broadcast return in 2022. The episode also remained unavailable on the Paramount Plus streaming service for an additional stretch of time after its broadcast return, meaning viewers looking to watch it through official streaming channels had to wait even longer than television audiences already had. When Nickelodeon finally did bring both episodes back for their delayed American premieres in April of 2022, the network's own promotional messaging leaned directly into the unusual situation surrounding them. According to entertainment coverage tracking the announcement, Nickelodeon specifically promoted the 2 returning episodes using language describing them as previously banned, presenting their long-delayed premieres as a notable event rather than quietly slipping them back into the normal broadcast rotation without comment. This choice to openly acknowledge and market the delay, rather than downplay it, stands in sharp contrast to the complete silence Nickelodeon has maintained around the reduced rerun schedule tied to one-course meal, showing two very different approaches the network has taken toward its own controversial or delayed content, depending on the specific situation involved. Taken together, Quarantined Crab represents something different from every other entry covered in this video so far. It carries no ties to internet horror writing, no anonymous claims, and no fan-made reinterpretation layered on top of it. It is simply a finished, ordinary episode that became strange purely because of when it was supposed to reach the world, delayed by an actual global event no writer could have predicted while the episode was still in production. Its story sits less as a piece of horror and more as a genuine piece of unlucky timing that ended up shaping the show's real broadcast history in a way almost nothing else on this list can claim. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every strange piece of this franchise comes from a single episode or a single controversy. The next entry pulls back from any one story entirely and looks instead at the real, documented history behind the town every character in this show calls home. Section 6, SB 129, the real episode that still unsettles fans. Every entry covered so far in this video involves either outside fiction, an official reference to that fiction, or a real-world controversy tied to a specific episode's subject matter or timing. SB 129 is different again. Nothing about it was ever controversial, pulled from air, or connected to any outside writer. It is simply a regular first-season episode that a large number of fans, watching it purely as a normal cartoon, still describe decades later as one of the strangest and most unsettling half-hours the show has ever produced. SB 129 first aired on December 31st, 1999, making it the final SpongeBob SquarePants episode to air during the entire 20th century, released alongside its paired episode Karate Choppers as part of a New Year's Eve lineup across several Nickelodeon shows. The episode carries a production code of 2515129, which is where its title actually comes from, and it was originally going to be called SpongeBob 3000 before the studio settled on the code-based title instead. It was written by Aaron Springer, Eric Wiesa, and Mr. Lawrence, the same performer whose writing work resurfaces again later in this video in connection with a very different, far more controversial episode. According to records kept by the show's own wiki, this was the first episode where Aaron Springer worked in the role of storyboard director rather than storyboard artist, marking a small but real shift in his position within the show's production pipeline. The episode carries a number of firsts within the franchise beyond just its behind-the-scenes credits. It stands as the first episode in the show's history where SpongeBob himself does not play a major role in the plot, since the story instead centers almost entirely on Squidward's personal journey through time. It also marks the first time the Krusty Krab appears on screen without Mr. Krabs present at all, since the restaurant is shown closed for the day at the point where Squidward hides inside it. Beyond those production firsts, SB 129 holds the distinction of being the first episode in the entire series built around the concept of time travel, and the first instance of what is generally known as a bootstrap paradox, a type of time loop where a person is inspired to travel through time because of an event that they themselves end up causing during that very same trip. This particular type of paradox plays out directly through Squidward's arc, since his fear of jellyfishing throughout the episode is what eventually drives him to invent the exact activity he spent the entire episode trying to avoid, creating a full circle where the effect and the cause of the story loop directly back into each other. The story begins with Squidward trying to enjoy a quiet Sunday practicing his clarinet, only to be interrupted repeatedly by SpongeBob and Patrick, who want him to go jellyfishing with them. Trying to escape the two of them, Squidward runs to the Krusty Krab and hides inside the walk-in freezer. Once SpongeBob and Patrick give up looking and leave, Squidward discovers the freezer handle has jammed, trapping him inside. He tells himself someone will eventually find him, but instead he stays frozen inside that freezer for 2,000 years. The door finally breaks down far in the future, where Squidward is thawed out by a robotic descendant of SpongeBob named Spongetron. By this point, nearly everything in Bikini Bottom has been replaced with chrome, including the buildings and surroundings, while the people themselves remain unchanged. Overwhelmed and desperate to return home, Squidward is pointed toward a time machine. Rather than simply returning to his own time, Squidward decides he would rather travel further back, to a point before SpongeBob was even born, hoping he might finally get some peace without his neighbors around to bother him. The machine sends him back hundreds of millions of years into a primitive version of Bikini Bottom, where he runs into primitive ancestors of SpongeBob and Patrick. In an attempt to stop them from repeatedly hurting themselves by grabbing jellyfish with their bare hands, Squidward accidentally teaches them how to catch jellyfish properly, unintentionally inventing the entire activity of jellyfishing millions of years before it becomes a normal pastime in his own time period. His attempt to finally relax and play his clarinet in peace fails once again, since the noise sends the two primitive creatures into a frenzy, chasing him back toward the time machine. In his rush to escape, Squidward accidentally breaks the time machine's controls. Instead of returning him to any point in time at all, the machine sends him somewhere else entirely, a place the episode simply calls nowhere. This section of the episode is the part most often singled out by fans as the moment where the tone shifts into something genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply strange or silly. Squidward finds himself standing in a completely empty white space with no visible end, no other characters, and no recognizable shapes beyond a few scattered colored panels beneath his feet. At first, he assumes finally being alone might be a relief after being surrounded by SpongeBob, Patrick, and endless strangers throughout his entire journey. That relief does not last. Distorted voices begin echoing around him, repeating the single word alone over and over, and every time Squidward tries to run away from the space, he ends up looping back to exactly where he started, with no visible exit anywhere. According to the show's own official wiki, the strange overlapping voices heard whispering the word alone during this scene were not performed by a single voice actor, but were instead recorded using the voices of the show's entire crew layered together, giving the moment an unusually dense, disorienting quality compared to the rest of the episode's normal sound design. Independent reviews of the episode written years later single out this exact scene as the point where the show briefly stops being funny and starts raising genuinely strange questions with no clear answer. One blog covering the show's full catalog, specifically calling the empty white space creepy and pointing out that the episode never explains what the location actually is, whether it exists before time itself, after the end of everything, or somewhere outside of time entirely. Squidward eventually escapes nowhere by falling through the floor back into the time machine, where he begs the machine, almost in a panic, to send him home. In that moment, he openly admits that he even misses SpongeBob, a rare instance of Squidward showing genuine vulnerability rather than his usual irritation. The machine grants his request, returning him to the present moment right where his disappearance first began. SpongeBob and Patrick, having no idea what he just went through, immediately ask him again if he wants to go jellyfishing, and the episode ends with Squidward realizing, to his own visible horror, that he was the one who accidentally invented the entire activity in the first place, meaning the annoying hobby he has spent the whole episode trying to avoid is something he is now personally responsible for creating. Beyond the nowhere sequence itself, several other details from the episode have kept fans returning to it over the years. The future segment introduces Spongetron, alongside 486 separate clones of himself, one representing each letter of an expanded alphabet the episode implies exists 2,000 years from now, a small detail that adds an odd sense of scale and unease to just how much time has actually passed. A calendar visible in the background of the future segment reads March 6, 2017, which places the episode's own present-day setting on March 6, 2017, a date that, at the time the episode originally aired in 1999, still sat 18 years out into the future itself, layering the show's own real-world future on top of the fictional future Squidward finds himself trapped inside. Reviewers and longtime viewers of the show have also noted that the episode borrows visual and conceptual ideas from well-known science fiction media, drawing loose comparisons to 2001: A Space Odyssey, along with the Woody Allen film Sleeper and general time travel concepts associated with the writing of H.G. Wells, giving the episode a stronger connection to serious science fiction imagery than almost anything else in the show's first season. The episode's connection to outside science fiction runs deeper than simple visual homage. According to detailed breakdowns of the episode's plot, SB-129 draws heavily from the general premise later used by the animated series Futurama, in which a pizza delivery worker named Fry is accidentally frozen at the turn of the millennium and wakes up centuries later in the future, a structure almost identical to what happens to Squidward across this same episode. This connection carries an unusually specific coincidence attached to it, since SB-129 originally aired on December 31st, 1999, the exact same date and setting used at the start of Futurama's own premiere episode, meaning two separate animated shows independently built stories around a character being frozen or displaced at that precise moment in time, without any confirmed connection between the two productions. Fans have continued ranking SB-129 highly within the show's broader catalog over the years, despite the episode's original broadcast performing unusually poorly by the standards of the show's early ratings. According to records tracking the show's viewership history, SB-129 and its paired episode Karate Choppers were the first two episodes in the entire series to fall under 2 million total viewers, a rating record that stood as the lowest in the show's history for years afterward, until it was eventually surpassed by a later episode called Sanctuary, which drew an even smaller audience of roughly 1.28 million viewers on its own premiere. Despite this rocky start in terms of live viewership, the episode's reputation among fans grew steadily stronger over the following decade. It placed at position 63 during a fan-voted marathon event called Best Day Ever in 2006, and climbed significantly higher to position 5 during a separate fan-voted event event called the Ultimate SpongeBob Sponge Bash in 2009, showing that its reputation only grew stronger among longtime viewers as the years went on, rather than fading the way many single Season 1 episodes eventually do. The episode's lasting popularity eventually led to a direct follow-up years later, with a Season 14 episode titled PL 1413, built specifically as a continuation tied back to the concepts first introduced inside SB 129, showing that even the show's own current writers still consider the original episode significant enough to revisit well over 2 decades after it first aired. What separates SB 129 from every other entry in this video is that nothing about it required outside interpretation, fan theory, or hidden meaning to become memorable. The unsettling parts of the episode are built directly into the official broadcast version every single viewer has always had access to, sitting in plain sight inside a normal Sunday morning cartoon, rather than hidden in a deleted scene, a pulled broadcast, or a piece of outside fan fiction. It stands as proof that the franchise never needed creepypasta writers or internet hoaxes to produce something fans still find genuinely strange, since the show managed to do that entirely on its own, 25 years before most of the stories covered earlier in this video ever existed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One small detail buried inside this same episode points towards something far bigger than a single unsettling scene. A brief shot of the real-world location the entire town of Bikini Bottom is built around, tied to a piece of history far darker than anything any writer working on the show ever needed to invent. Section 7. Bikini Bottom's real nuclear origins. Bikini Bottom, the underwater town where SpongeBob and every other character in the show lives, takes its name directly from Bikini Atoll, a real coral reef made up of 23 small islands located in the Marshall Islands, out in the Pacific Ocean. This connection has been directly confirmed, not left as pure fan speculation. In a 2015 interview with HuffPost, Tom Kenny, the voice actor who has played SpongeBob since the show began, confirmed that the fictional town is named after the real Bikini Atoll. This removes any doubt about where the name originally came from, since it comes straight from the voice of the show's own lead character. The real history behind Bikini Atoll is far darker than anything found in the cartoon itself. After the end of World War II, the United States took control of the Marshall Islands and identified Bikini Atoll as an ideal location to test the effects of nuclear weapons, largely because of how remote the area was and how few people lived there. Before testing began, the atoll's small population, generally recorded as around 167 people, was relocated away from their home, with promises that they would eventually be allowed to return once testing had finished. Nuclear testing at the site began under a program called Operation Crossroads, which opened with a bomb codenamed Able, detonated in the air above a collection of decommissioned warships anchored in the atoll's lagoon on July 1, 1946. A second test, codenamed Baker, followed several weeks later, this time detonated underwater, sending a massive column of water into the air and damaging dozens of the target vessels positioned around it. A planned third test under the same operation was ultimately scrapped, and Operation Crossroads itself concluded on August 10, 1946, largely due to growing concern among military officials about the radiation exposure faced by the personnel involved in running the tests. Testing at the site continued well beyond that first operation. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated a total of 23 nuclear devices at Bikini Atoll, specifically as part of a much larger nuclear testing program across the wider Marshall Islands that eventually totaled 67 separate detonations. The single most destructive of these tests took place on March 1, 1954, under an operation called Castle, with a device codenamed Bravo. Scientists running the test had expected an explosive yield of roughly 6 megatons. Due to an unexpected reaction involving one of the materials used inside the device, the actual explosion reached approximately 15 megatons, more than double what had been predicted, and roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima at the end of World War II. The blast carved a crater into the reef roughly a mile wide and spread radioactive fallout across an area estimated at more than 7,000 square miles, reaching neighboring atolls including Rongelap, located more than 100 miles away, where residents began showing signs of radiation exposure almost immediately afterward. The Castle Bravo test also affected people far outside the American testing zone entirely. A Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon No. 5, carrying 23 crew members, was operating outside the official danger zone at the time of the blast, yet still ended up exposed to the fallout drifting from the explosion. According to accounts from the incident, some of the fishermen aboard the boat initially mistook the falling radioactive ash for ordinary snow, unaware of what they were actually being exposed to, until symptoms of radiation sickness began appearing among the crew afterward. In the days immediately following the Castle Bravo test, the United States also launched a controversial program known as Project 4.1, organized within roughly a week of the explosion, built around studying the medical effects of radiation exposure on the Marshall Islands residents who who had been caught in the fallout, a program that has remained a point of serious controversy in the decades since due to questions over how much informed consent the affected residents were actually given. Residents of Bikini Atoll were eventually allowed to return to their home in 1969, more than a decade after testing had ended. That return did not last. Testing later in the 1970s revealed that food and soil on the island remained contaminated with dangerous levels of radiation, and in 1978, residents were evacuated a second time, after those tests confirmed the area was still unsafe for long-term habitation. To this day, the atoll remains uninhabited because of that same contamination, and the people originally displaced from it have never been able to permanently resettle their ancestral home. Compensation for the affected communities has remained a source of ongoing tension between the Marshallese people and the United States government. A compensation trust fund worth $150 million was established as part of a later agreement between the two governments, and a dedicated nuclear claims tribunal was created specifically to award payments tied to cancers, burns, and birth defects connected to the testing program. Despite this, in 1988, an international tribunal ordered the United States to pay an additional $2.3 billion in further reparations, a ruling the United States has never honored, maintaining that its financial obligations ended once the earlier compact payments were completed. Despite this difficult history, Bikini Atoll has since been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a designation it received in 2010, largely due to its significance as one of the most extensively documented nuclear testing locations in the world. In an unusual twist tied to the decades of abandonment that followed the testing program, the almost total absence of human activity around the atoll has allowed marine life to recover in unexpected ways, with coral reefs and a wide range of ocean species now thriving throughout the same lagoon where some of the most powerful nuclear explosions in history once took place. Stephen Hillenburg, the marine biologist who created SpongeBob SquarePants, had a strong background connected to ocean science well before the show ever existed. He studied marine biology and minored in art at Humboldt State University, and before working in animation, he spent time educating the public about marine science, during which he created an educational comic called The Intertidal Zone, featuring an early version of a sponge character that would eventually evolve into SpongeBob himself. Given this background, choosing to set an entire undersea town beneath a real location tied to one of history's most significant nuclear testing programs was very unlikely to have been a random decision. This connection between the show and real history gave rise to a well-known fan theory that spread widely online, particularly through a popular Reddit post credited to a user named Capmaster. The theory argues that the reason Bikini Bottom's residents behave the way they do, sea creatures that talk, hold jobs, drive vehicles, play instruments, and build robots, comes directly from decades of radiation exposure following the real nuclear tests carried out above their home. According to the theory, this radiation caused widespread mutation among the sea life living beneath Bikini Atoll, explaining both their human-like intelligence and behavior, along with the unusually strange and exaggerated traits many characters display throughout the series. This specific explanation, tying every strange trait in the show directly to radiation exposure, remains a fan theory rather than something confirmed by the show's creators, even though the underlying setting it is built around is entirely real and confirmed. Part of this broader theory did receive a genuine, direct response from someone involved in making the show. Doug Lawrence, a writer on SpongeBob SquarePants, confirmed that an early version of the show's concept was connected to a much darker premise than what audiences ultimately saw. According to that confirmation, an early idea explored during the show's development involved the rest of the world being wiped out following some kind of large-scale, post-apocalyptic event, leaving Bikini Bottom as one of the only places where life continued to exist. This concept was scrapped very early during the development of the first season, meaning it never became part of the show audiences actually know, but its existence during early development shows that ideas connecting the town's setting to some kind of large-scale disaster were genuinely discussed behind the scenes at some point, even if they were ultimately dropped before the show took its final shape. Mr. Lawrence, who voices Plankton and has also worked as a writer on the show, later commented further on the wider nuclear testing theory in an interview with Esquire, acknowledging it as part of the fun surrounding how far fans have taken the concept of Bikini Bottom's connection to a real nuclear test site. Some coverage of this interview also points out that certain explosion effects used throughout the show visually echo the shape of real nuclear test photographs taken at Bikini Atoll, adding one more layer connecting the show's visual style back to the real history tied to its setting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Taken as a whole, this section sits apart from anything covered earlier, since it requires no scary story, no pulled episode, and no internet hoax to hold up. A real historical tragedy sits quietly underneath the entire town the show is built around, confirmed by name, hinted at by a writer's own comments about an early scrapped concept, and expanded on endlessly by fans who noticed a real-world detail hiding in plain sight since 1999. From here, the writing behind this single detail connects into a much larger pattern. The flood of fan-made stories the original Lost episode hoax inspired, and just how far that copying spread once one story proved how well the formula worked. Section 8. The Copycat Wave. Once Squidward's suicide proved how effectively a fake Lost episode story could spread, it stopped being a single piece of writing and became a template. Other anonymous writers noticed the reaction the original story pulled in and began producing their own versions of the same basic idea, a normal SpongeBob episode hiding something forbidden that was never meant to reach the public. This section looks at how that copying played out, what these later stories actually claimed, and why the flood of copies eventually became a problem for the very communities that had helped the original story spread in the first place. One of the clearer examples of this copying pattern is a story usually titled Death Sponge. According to the version posted on a dedicated creepypasta wiki, the writer claims that during a review of Season 8 material in 2011, a box turned up containing a disc labeled Death Sponge, discovered alongside other legitimate season material. Believing it might be some kind of inside joke, the writer and others involved decided to play it anyway. The story describes the episode opening with the normal SpongeBob intro before cutting to a distorted title card and a jarring, unpleasant sound replacing the usual theme music. According to the account, the footage shows Patrick catching jellyfish alone, without SpongeBob present, repeating the same short scene 3 separate times before cutting to a black screen, accompanied by strange noises and a loud scream. The story then describes a graveyard scene showing Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, and Sandy standing together, crying, in front of a small number of grave markers, one of which reads, SpongeBob SquarePants. This particular story ended up heavily criticized by reviewers on the same site that hosted it, who pointed out serious problems with basic spelling, grammar, and structure throughout the writing. Reviewers noted that lines describing key moments, such as the discovery of the disc or the final scream, read as rushed and underdeveloped compared to the level of detail found in the original Squidward suicide post. Because of these issues, Death Sponge was ultimately rejected from meeting that site's standard requirements for a proper Lost episode submission, illustrating how far the overall quality dropped once the format moved from its original creator to a wave of less careful imitators trying to recreate the same basic formula. A second example, generally known as Patrick's Death, takes a slightly different approach, framing itself less like an official leaked tape and more like an accidental online discovery. According to the version posted on a dedicated Trollpasta wiki, the narrator describes coming across what looked like a screenshot from an unofficial SpongeBob episode while browsing videos online during a period of illness. The story describes SpongeBob and Patrick laughing outside as normal, while Squidward is shown inside his house with bloodshot eyes and a visibly twitching eyelid, borrowing the same basic visual language of unsettling eyes that had already become closely associated with the original Squidward suicide story years earlier. This reuse of a very specific visual detail, rather than inventing something new, shows how directly later writers pulled from the exact imagery that had already worked once, rather than building fresh ideas of their own. A separate story sharing a similar name but a very different history, generally titled Dead Patrick, shows just how unstable this entire genre of writing became once it spread far enough. According to a detailed account posted on a dedicated Lost episode creepypasta wiki, one reader described searching for years to relocate a story they remembered reading around 2012, originally hosted on a small, loosely moderated wiki. The reader recalled being called something close to Taylor's Lost Episodes, a site that no longer exists. As the reader described it, the story followed a fairly standard setup for the genre, an unnamed narrator finding a DVD inside the Nickelodeon Studios building and taking it home to watch, only for the disc to reveal a title card reading Dead Patrick, styled using a plain, generator-style font layered over a silhouette of the character. What makes this particular story stand out is not the plot itself, which the same reader admitted felt fairly ordinary and familiar for the genre, but the fact that once they went looking for confirmation of what they remembered, other readers who claimed to have seen the same story described completely different scenes and imagery than what the original poster remembered. One commenter specifically stated that their own memory of the story contained no scene showing SpongeBob harming Patrick, contradicting a detail the original poster believed had been central to the plot. A separate version of the story, hosted on a different fan wiki entirely, describes an entirely different scene altogether, opening with SpongeBob and Patrick standing against a plain white background, with SpongeBob coldly telling Patrick that their friendship is over before the story shifts to Patrick alone, crying, before pulling out a crudely drawn gun and shooting himself, ending on a crudely drawn image of his body. Taken together, these conflicting versions of Dead Patrick show a problem that never affected the original Squidward suicide post in the same way. Because Squidward's suicide was written once, saved, and copied verbatim across many different sites, later readers could always trace the story back to a fairly consistent, shared version of the text. Dead Patrick, by contrast, appears to have existed primarily on a poorly archived, unmoderated wiki that no longer exists, meaning the story survived largely through the shaky memory of readers who had encountered different, possibly unrelated unrelated versions of it years apart, each recalling different specific imagery as though they were describing the same original source. This kind of fractured, unreliable spread represents a different kind of decay than the simple drop in writing quality seen in stories like Death Sponge, showing that some corners of this copycat wave became so informal and poorly preserved that even the people who remembered reading them could no longer agree on what the actual story had said. A third example, generally referred to as The End of Bikini Bottom, takes the format in a broader direction, moving away from a single character's suffering and toward the destruction of the entire town. According to the version hosted on a dedicated Final Hours creepypasta wiki, this story describes a supposedly banned Season 8 episode in which an asteroid strikes Bikini Bottom directly, wiping out the town while characters scream and panic in the moments before impact. The story description includes a countdown sequence voiced by what the writer describes as a robotic voice, followed by scenes of destruction spreading across recognizable locations from the show, including SpongeBob's pineapple house being destroyed in the explosion. Unlike Squidward's suicide, which focused entirely on one character's private breakdown, this story tries to scale the horror up to an entire town-ending event, showing how later writers experimented with different types of disturbing content once the basic lost episode format had already been established by earlier stories. A fourth example, hosted on a separate site called Spongebob Wiki, under a title referencing a supposed website called freespongebobepisodes.com, pushes the format even further into disturbing territory. According to that story, footage supposedly found through the site shows SpongeBob screaming, while clips of real-world violence, including footage resembling car accidents, people falling from buildings, and scenes resembling actual shootings, flash across the screen, alongside recurring dark figures appearing in every scene. The story ends with a note supposedly left behind reading that the world of Bikini Bottom is coming to an end, and that this represents a final message before everything stops. This particular story leans much harder into graphic, real-world styled violence compared to Squidward's suicide, illustrating how later imitators often escalated the shock value of their stories in an attempt to stand out, even though this escalation frequently came at the cost of the more restrained, believable tone that made the original story effective in the first place. Beyond written stories, this wave of copying extended into video content as well. Creators began producing their own video versions of similarly styled, lost episode concepts, including one titled Bikini Bottom's Blackout, built using the same basic structure of a supposedly leaked or banned piece of SpongeBob footage, revealing something dark hidden behind the show's usual tone. These video versions relied on edited clips, distorted audio, and jump cut editing to simulate the feeling of watching a corrupted or forbidden broadcast, following the same visual approach that had already become common across this entire wave of copycat content by that point. Unlike the written stories, which required a reader to imagine the described imagery entirely inside their own head, these video versions gave audiences something to actually look at and listen to directly, lowering the barrier for casual viewers to stumble across the content without needing to actively seek out a written story on a dedicated horror wiki first. The wider ecosystem hosting this material also grew in scale, well beyond the handful of specific stories detailed above. A dedicated category tracking SpongeBob-related entries on one major lost episode creepypasta wiki lists dozens of separate titles connected to the show, covering everything from short, single-scene stories to more developed multi-part pastas, spanning a wide range of writing quality and internal consistency. This kind of dedicated category, existing specifically to organize an entire subgenre of stories built around one children's cartoon, only makes sense once a large enough volume of separate writers had each contributed their own individual entry to the same general tradition, treating SpongeBob lost episode writing less like a novelty and more like an established, recognized category within the wider creepypasta community. The sheer number of these stories, spread out across multiple different wikis and hosting sites over the following years, eventually created problems for the communities hosting them. According to information gathered from a page tracking the original Squidward's suicide story, the volume of similar lost episode pastas grew large enough that certain creepypasta wikis made the decision to stop accepting new lost episode submissions entirely, since so many of the newer stories submitted were seen as low-effort copies following the exact same structure the original story had already used first. This represents a fairly rare outcome within online horror writing communities, where an entire subgenre became so oversaturated with copies that some of the platforms responsible for hosting that type of content chose to shut the door on new submissions altogether, rather than continuing to host an endless stream of stories, repeating the same basic idea with only minor changes. Looking at these examples together shows a clear pattern in how the copying developed over time. The earliest copies, like Death Sponge and Patrick's Death, stayed fairly close to the original format, focusing on a single disturbing episode centered around one or two characters, often directly reusing specific imagery, such as bloodshot eyes, that had already proven effective in the original story. A parallel branch of that early copying, represented by stories like Dead Patrick, shows a different kind of drift entirely, where the format survived less through careful preservation and more through fragmented secondhand memory, producing multiple conflicting versions of what was supposedly the same story. Later copies, like the end of Bikini Bottom and the Free SpongeBob episode story, pushed the scale and shock value further, moving from personal horror toward town-wide destruction or graphic real-world violence, likely in an attempt to stand out after so many earlier stories had already covered similar ground using a similar tone. This escalation pattern is common across many different types of copycat internet content, where later imitators often push a successful format toward more extreme territory in an attempt to recapture the same level of attention the original managed to generate. None of the stories covered in this section carry any real connection to Nickelodeon, the actual production of the show, or any confirmed leaked footage of any kind. Every single one exists purely as anonymous fan-written horror fiction, hosted across a range of different creepypasta and horror writing wikis, built entirely on top of the format Squidward's Suicide first established back in 2005. Taken together, they show exactly how far a single successful piece of internet horror writing can spread once other writers start treating it less like a finished story and more like a formula worth copying over and over again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One piece of this same lost episode tradition eventually grew large enough to step outside of pure text and wiki pages entirely, taking the shape of a fully playable video game built directly around the original story that started this entire wave in the first place. Section 9. Red Mist, the fan game, built from the creepypasta. Every entry covered in this video so far has stayed inside written stories, video edits, or a single official reference buried inside an actual episode. In February of 2020, the Squidward's Suicide creepypasta took a different shape entirely, turning from something people read or watched into something people could actually play through themselves. The game, titled Red Mist, was created by a developer using the name LeoShock and released for free on the independent game platform itch.io. According to the developer's own posts, this was their first completed game, built using the Unity engine while they were still learning how to use many of its tools, something they openly mentioned in later comments responding to players. Despite being an early, first attempt at game development, Red Mist managed to reach a wide audience within a short amount of time after its release. The game builds its own short storyline directly out of the Squidward's Suicide creepypasta, rather than simply recreating scenes from the original story. According to the game's own description, Squidward is found dead inside his house on January 7, 2000, discovered by SpongeBob and Patrick. The in-game Bikini Bottom police begin an investigation, but find no clear evidence pointing to another person being involved. And since the gun is found in Squidward's own hand, the death is officially treated as a suicide. A few days later, according to the story, SpongeBob and Patrick themselves are reported missing, last seen entering Squidward's house late at night. As the police continue investigating, they discover a hidden cellar door inside the house that had gone unnoticed before. The player takes on the role of one of the responding police officers, tasked with entering that cellar to find out what actually happened. Playing through the game involves searching Squidward's house from a first-person perspective, looking for 7 separate items connected to Squidward, scattered throughout the environment. According to the game's own instructions, the number of these items a player manages to find directly changes which ending they receive once the game concludes, giving Red Mist multiple different possible outcomes depending on how thoroughly a player explores the house before finishing their investigation. Comments left directly on the game's itch.io page by players describe encountering at least 4 distinct main endings, generally referred to by players as death, escape, corrupted, and an ending tied to the number 129, referencing the same time travel episode covered earlier in this video, in which the story reveals Mr. Krabs as the one responsible for what happened to Squidward, adding an unexpected connection between 2 completely separate pieces of SpongeBob content already covered across this video. Multiple players specifically described the SB-129 ending as the hardest of the 4 to actually reach, requiring a much more thorough playthrough than the game's other, more straightforward outcomes. Beyond those 4 main endings, the game hides a 5th fully secret ending behind a multi-step puzzle that most players never stumbled onto without outside help. According to a post made directly by LeoShock in response to player questions, unlocking this hidden ending first requires a player to reach the corrupted ending during a normal playthrough. Doing so reveals a short code displayed on the game's end screen, which turns out to be the identifier for a YouTube video posted separately from the game itself. Watching that video shows 3 specific objects, described in-game as cans, highlighted within the game's environment. Returning to the game and correctly clicking on all 3 of those specific cans, confirm to the player through an audio cue when the right one is selected, and then collecting all 7 of the original search items before finishing the game, teleports the player into the hidden secret ending rather than any of the 4 standard outcomes. This kind of layered, externally connected puzzle, requiring a player to leave the game entirely and consult an outside video before returning to finish it, goes well beyond the kind of simple item collection most fan-made horror games settle for, showing a level of structural ambition animation unusual for what the developer themselves described as a first attempt at making a game. The game also hides a separate, smaller puzzle built around a piece of Morse code discoverable somewhere within its environment. According to a direct comment left by LeoShock responding to a player who was struggling to work it out, the hidden Morse code translates to the single word watch, offering players a small additional layer of mystery beyond the main hunt for Squidward's 7 items and the 4 visible endings. Design choices behind the game reflect its status as an early, learning project as much as its content does. According to comments from the developer, the game deliberately limits how long a player can sprint at any given time, a decision made specifically to stop players from simply running through the entire house without engaging with its atmosphere or searching properly for clues. LeoShock also acknowledged in direct responses to players that early versions of the game shipped with at least one bug affecting the chase sequence meant to occur near the game's final hallway, where the player is meant to be pursued by a version of Squidward's disembodied head as they attempt to escape. According to the developer's own comments, this bug was later identified and fixed following player reports, meaning some of the earliest people to play Red Mist experienced a version of the game that skipped over content the developer had originally intended everyone to encounter. Unlike the original written creepypasta, which relied entirely on a reader's imagination to picture the described violence and unsettling imagery, Red Mist gave players a version of the story they could physically walk through and investigate on their own terms, searching rooms, uncovering clues, and reaching an ending shaped by their own choices during play. This kind of hands-on, interactive format spreads differently than a written story or a short video clip, since it invites content creators specifically built around reacting to and playing horror games to pick it up and share their own experience working through it in real time. That is exactly what happened following the game's release. According to a page dedicated to tracking games played by popular YouTuber Markiplier, Red Mist was one of the games he played and covered on his channel not long after its release, introducing the game and the creepypasta behind it to an audience far larger than the horror writing communities that had originally kept Squidward's suicide alive for the previous 15 years. Beyond Markiplier, multiple other YouTubers uploaded their own separate playthrough videos covering the game, several explicitly framing their videos around the connection to the original Squidward creepypasta rather than treating the game as a standalone horror title, showing that audiences engaging with it were already familiar with or specifically interested in learning more about the story the game was built from. Comments left underneath the game itself, spanning multiple languages including at least one detailed comment written entirely in Spanish, confirmed that the game reached players well beyond any single English-speaking audience, with international players specifically describing it as based on one of their own favorite existing creepypastas rather than something entirely unfamiliar to them. Player reception, based on the extensive public comment section left directly on the game's page, was largely positive given the game's status as an unpaid, independently made fan project. Several commenters specifically praised the atmosphere and mystery built around figuring out all of the different endings, with more than one player describing the process of decoding the secret ending specifically as one of the most enjoyable parts of the experience. A recurring request appearing across many separate comments asked LeoShock whether a sequel might eventually be made, though no confirmed announcement of a continuation appears anywhere in the developer's own public responses. The game's release led to an unusual side effect completely unrelated to SpongeBob itself. A separate, unrelated video game, also originally titled Red Mist and built around entirely different subject matter, ended up changing its own name to Dark Mist during the same general period. According to discussion threads from players of that separate game, the developers made this change specifically because so many videos uploaded to YouTube using the title Red Mist were actually gameplay footage of the Squidward-focused fan game, making it difficult for players interested in the original, unrelated title to find accurate footage or reviews of their own game under its original name. This detail, while small, shows just how completely the fan-made Squidward game had taken over search results and public association with the name Red Mist within a fairly short window of time after its release. Red Mist represents a turning point in how this particular piece of internet horror history continued to spread. Everything covered earlier in this video relied on reading or watching something passively, whether through an original written post, a fan video recreation, or a brief official flash inside an actual episode. A playable game changes that relationship entirely, letting an audience member physically search through Squidward's house, choose how thoroughly to investigate, and personally uncover whichever ending their own choices lead them toward, turning a 15-year-old piece of anonymous internet writing into something new audiences could experience firsthand rather than simply read about secondhand. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Even after reaching players through a fully built, playable game covered by some of the biggest names in online video content, this same corner of SpongeBob horror content still has one far smaller, far more obscure branch left to cover, built not around Squidward at all, but around a completely different piece of internet horror mixed directly into the world of Bikini Bottom. Section 10. SpongeBob SlenderPants. The bottom Bottom of the Iceberg, where Red Mist turned the Squidward suicide creepypasta into a story players could investigate room by room. An earlier and far more obscure fan game took a completely different real-world internet horror trend and mixed it into the world of Bikini Bottom years before Red Mist ever existed, sitting as one of the least-known pieces of content covered across this entire video. To understand why a game like this existed at all, it helps to look at where the character it borrows from actually came from. Slender Man began life as a piece of creative writing posted by a user named Eric Knudsen using the online name Victor Surge on a forum called Something Awful in June of 2009. The character was created as part of a contest on that forum, challenging users to edit ordinary photographs into something paranormal looking. Knudsen submitted a pair of black and white images showing groups of children, each edited to include a tall, unnaturally thin figure standing in the background wearing a plain black suit with no visible face at all. Alongside the images, Knudsen wrote short snippets of fake witness testimony describing children disappearing around the figure, giving the character its name and its earliest pieces of backstory in the same post that introduced its image to the world. The character spread extremely quickly once it left that original forum. Just 10 days after Knudsen's original post, a web series called Marble Hornets launched on YouTube, created by Troy Wagner and Joseph Delage, expanding the character into a much larger, ongoing horror mythology and giving it the additional name, The Operator. That series ran for 87 separate video entries across 5 years and directly inspired a wide network of similar fan-made series that grew up around the same character, collectively referred to by fans as the Slenderverse. Within just 2 weeks of the character's creation, the concept had already spread across other major online communities, including the paranormal discussion board of 4chan, showing how quickly a single piece of anonymous internet writing could travel across completely separate corners of the internet once it caught on. The character's biggest jump into mainstream popularity came 3 years later, with the release of a video game built specifically around it. Slender, the 8 Pages, was developed entirely by one person, Mark J. Hadley, working under the name Agent Parsec through his own one-man studio called Parsec Productions. Hadley built the game using the Unity engine, drawing inspiration from the atmosphere of the horror game Amnesia: The Dark Descent and from his own enjoyment of the Marble Hornets series, and released it as a free download in June of 2012. The game's design stayed deliberately simple, placing the player inside a dark forest with only a flashlight, tasked with collecting 8 scattered handwritten pages while avoiding direct contact with Slender Man, who slowly stalks the player throughout the map. There is no combat in the game, no dialogue, and no scoring system, relying entirely on movement and a slowly building sense of dread to create tension. The game spread rapidly online, helped significantly by a widely viewed recorded playthrough from the YouTuber PewDiePie, which drove enough downloads to Hadley's own website that it reportedly crashed under the demand shortly after release. Critics generally praised the game's atmosphere and effective use of tension, despite its crude, low-budget graphics, though some criticism focused on its repetitive gameplay and limited replay value once a player had already learned the general layout of the forest. The success of Slender, the 8 Pages, inspired an enormous wave of independently made fan games built around the same basic structure, applying the same core mechanics, collecting scattered items while avoiding a stalking figure, to a huge range of different settings and characters entirely unrelated to the original mythology. Hadley himself moved on from the character fairly quickly, announcing on his own social media, roughly a year after the game's release, that he intended to work on projects unrelated to Slender Man going forward, even as a full sequel titled Slender: The Arrival, developed jointly with a studio called Blue Isle Studios, released the following year to continue the character's story in a larger, more developed form. The character's reach extended well beyond gaming and web series into real-world tragedy as well. In May of 2014, 2 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, stabbed a classmate multiple times, later telling investigators their actions were connected to a belief in Slender Man. The victim survived the attack. This incident drew significant mainstream news coverage at the time and led to renewed public conversation about the character's cultural reach, eventually becoming the subject of an academic study examining the broader phenomenon surrounding the character's spread. By the time SpongeBob SlenderPants was built the following year, Slender Man had already grown from a single anonymous forum post into one of the most widely recognized horror figures on the entire internet, reaching not just horror fans but a much broader mainstream audience as well. The game, generally known as SpongeBob SlenderPants, though also referred to by fans under names like SlenderPants and SlendyPants, was built by a small team working under the name Digital Missile Studio. According to records kept by Encyclopedia Spongebobia, the developers behind the project were Ed Rowe, Liam DeWall, Jack Kogan, and Reese Saldanha, working together on the Unity engine to build the game from the ground up. It first went live on March 25, 2013, with the developers continuing to update it over the following weeks, adding new features and fixes through several versions before settling into a more complete build released on April 28 of that same year. Rather than pulling directly from any existing SpongeBob Spongebob Creepypasta, this game borrowed its entire concept from a completely different piece of internet horror that had already become massively popular by that point. SpongeBob SquarePants takes the exact same structure established by Hadley's original game and reskins nearly every part of it using SpongeBob characters and imagery instead. In this version, the player controls an unseen version of Patrick Star, holding a flashlight while wandering through a large, dark forest map. Instead of collecting pages, the objective becomes gathering 8 scattered Krabby Patties hidden throughout the map, a detail that was specifically changed during one of the game's early updates, since the objective originally used plain pages before being swapped out for the more recognizable SpongeBob food item. Stalking the player throughout this search is a character the game calls SlenderPants, built using a reskinned, T-posing version of SpongeBob himself that slowly and constantly moves toward the player as they search. According to descriptions of the game's mechanics, staring directly at SlenderPants or allowing him to get too close causes the player's screen to gradually darken. If the screen turns completely black, the player is hit with a jump scare, showing a close-up image of SlenderPants' face, before being sent back to the game's main menu to start over. As a player successfully collects more Krabby Patties, SlenderPants moves faster and becomes more dangerous to avoid, ramping up the difficulty the closer a player gets to actually finishing the game. Despite its rough, low-budget presentation and its status as a small, independently made fan project, the game managed to reach a surprisingly wide audience shortly after release. According to Encyclopedia Spongebobia, the game did not gain real popularity immediately after its initial launch, but picked up significant attention roughly a week later once YouTuber Markiplier played through it on his channel. Wiki pages dedicated to tracking Markiplier's full catalog of played games confirm SpongeBob SlenderPants as one of the titles he covered, describing the core objective as collecting the game's items before SlenderPants catches the player. Separate wiki records tied to another major horror gaming YouTuber, Jacksepticeye, confirm that he also played through and completed the game on his own channel, giving the small fan project exposure across 2 of the largest horror gaming audiences on the platform at the time. What makes SpongeBob SlenderPants worth closing this entire video on is how little it actually shares with everything covered before it. It carries no connection to Squidward, no tieback to the original 2005 creepypasta, no reference to any real episode, and no connection to any real-world event or controversy tied to the show itself. Its entire premise instead borrows from a separate piece of internet history altogether, one that had already grown from a single forum post into a global phenomenon touching everything from viral gaming culture to a real criminal case, before 4 independent developers ever decided to graft it onto the world of Bikini Bottom. It exists purely as a small, independently made mashup between 2 separate pieces of internet culture, a beloved children's cartoon and one of the biggest horror trends the internet had produced up to that point, built by a handful of developers working on their own, with no backing from Nickelodeon or any larger studio behind it. Its popularity came entirely from a handful of horror gaming YouTubers choosing to feature it, rather than from any built-in connection to the wider SpongeBob horror mythology explored throughout the rest of this video. Every entry covered across this video, from a single anonymous board post in 2005 all the way down to a small reskinned horror game built by 4 independent developers in 2013, borrowing from an entirely separate piece of internet mythology, traces back to the same basic idea, taking something familiar, comforting, and safe, and quietly turning it into something else entirely. Some of these stories were pure fiction from the very beginning. Some were built by name, using real credited artists. A few were not fiction at all, tied instead to real episodes, real network decisions, and real history sitting underneath the town itself. Together, they form a complete picture of just how far one children's cartoon has traveled through the internet's darkest corners, one piece at a time, over more than 2 decades. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.